It was just another ordinary day at work until the moment he walked into my life, briefly, but in a way that would change everything I thought I knew about connection, time, and human resilience. What happened next, you won't believe. A son, a mother, a woman caught in between. This was the day I learned something about life I didn't expect to find. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It's funny how sometimes life has a way of rearranging the pieces without you ever asking for it. One minute you're walking through the same routine, caught in the humdrum of work, the comfort of your own predictability. Then the next, something shifts. It all started with that phone call. My colleague Ellie had been talking about her son for weeks. David, a quiet kid, always in and out of school, figuring out where he belonged in the world. Ellie's voice always softened when she spoke about him, but there was something else in the air when she did, an undercurrent of worry she couldn't quite mask. "He's coming to the office today," Ellie said, almost like she didn't believe it herself. "Just to see me for a bit. You're gonna love him, I think." I remember nodding, as I often did. My office space was a little too cluttered for surprise visits. I had just gotten back from a long meeting, and my desk was full of files, not to mention the half-finished coffee cup that I probably should have thrown out hours ago. When David finally walked into the room, I wasn't prepared for how he would make me feel. He was young, around 20 or so, I think. Tall but thin, and the kind of guy who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders, though you wouldn't notice unless you looked closely. He had those tired eyes, the kind that were far too old for someone his age. It was as if he'd been through something hard, before most of us even thought about adulthood. "Hi," he said, his voice unsure but kind. He had a little wave with his hand, almost like he didn't know how to introduce himself properly. The way he smiled at me was, well, not quite what I expected. You see, I was already acquainted with Ellie. I knew the way she talked about him, and I figured he'd have a little of her energy, too. Bubbly, maybe a little loud, the sort of youthful enthusiasm you expect from someone that age. But David? No, he was different. There was a quiet intensity to him, something that made me want to stop whatever I was doing just to understand what was beneath the surface. "David, right?" I said, standing up from my desk, my fingers brushing against the stack of papers as I straightened my posture. "It's nice to meet you." He nodded but didn't say much after that, his gaze dropping just a little as though he was too self-conscious to hold eye contact for too long. And that was when I realized I wasn't the only one who felt awkward. Ellie had already turned her chair to face him. "David," she said, her voice full of pride, "this is Jane. She's the one I've been telling you about. Works just down the hall." He gave me another quick glance, still quiet. It was a strange kind of energy, the way we were all standing there, unsure of how to break the silence. I tried to lighten the mood by offering him the only thing I could think of, a cup of coffee. He hesitated, and for a moment I wasn't sure if he would accept. "Sure," he finally said, and I motioned toward the coffee machine in the corner of the room. As I poured the coffee, I couldn't help but notice that his eyes seemed to linger on everything but me, on the office decorations, the odd little plant in the corner of the room, the way the morning light filtered in through the blinds. His movements were subtle, almost like he was trying to fit himself into this unfamiliar space without disturbing it. "Long drive?" I asked, handing him the cup, just to fill the silence. He looked up then, his gaze slightly sharper. "No, just not much of a talker. Never have been." His words were simple, but they made me pause. There was an honesty there, a rawness I didn't expect. He didn't seem to be trying to make excuses, and that made me want to understand him more. "Nothing wrong with that," I replied, sitting back down. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. He glanced at me then, just a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. That look, that brief moment of shared understanding, stayed with me. It felt like he was trying to say something without actually having to speak it. Maybe it was the way his shoulders had relaxed just a little, or the way he let out a quiet breath, like he wasn't so worried about being judged anymore. Ellie, busy with some paperwork on the other side of the room, was still talking about all the things she had planned for the office. But there was something about David's presence that made me feel like the rest of the world had faded out for just a moment. And for some reason, I wanted to hold on to that feeling. Just as I thought we might settle into a comfortable silence, David looked up, his expression suddenly shifting. It was subtle at first, but I noticed it, the way he seemed to search for something in my face. "You ever feel like you're stuck between two worlds?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. "Like you're not really here, but not really there either?" I blinked, taken aback. It was such a strange question, coming from someone so young. But before I could answer, he shook his head, almost like he regretted asking it. "Forget I said that." But I didn't forget. It lingered. In that moment, I realized that this quiet young man, who had come into my life only for a brief moment, was already making me question things I had never thought about before. His question stuck with me like a memory that wouldn't fade. Something had shifted in me, but I wasn't sure yet what it was. The day was still young, and I had no idea how much David would come to mean to me in the next few hours, or the profound impact his presence would have on my life. But as I looked at him then, sipping his coffee in silence, I felt something stirring inside me, a sense of connection I couldn't quite explain. And I think, for the first time in a long while, I was beginning to understand what it meant to really listen. Not just to the words people said, but to the spaces between them. To the unspoken things, the quiet moments that speak volumes. And that right there was where the story truly began. I didn't expect to see David again anytime soon. After that brief moment in the office, I figured he would slip back into his own life, and I would return to mine, both of us returning to our familiar routines. But life, it seems, has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. It was about a week later when Ellie came by my desk, a slightly frantic look on her face. "Hey, I need a favor. David, well, he's in a bit of a spot right now, and I could really use your help." I stopped what I was doing, surprised by the urgency in her voice. "What happened?" Ellie hesitated for a second, chewing on her lower lip. "He's been staying with me for the past month. Well, trying to anyway. But things aren't exactly going well. He's been having some trouble adjusting, and he doesn't really open up to me. I don't know what to do anymore, Jane." The concern in her eyes was enough to pull me in, and before I even thought about it, I found myself nodding. "What do you need me to do?" Ellie's face softened, grateful but tired. "Just talk to him. You're the only person he seems to listen to without, feeling judged. Can you come by my place tonight? He won't talk to me, but maybe you can get through to him." I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, I'll be there." And that's how I found myself driving to Ellie's house later that evening, not entirely sure what to expect. I had agreed to help her, but what could I possibly say to a young man who barely spoke to anyone? Who, from the outside, seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders? I pulled up to Ellie's house just as the last light of day was fading into the evening sky. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of peaceful suburban area where everyone knew everyone else. Ellie's home was warm and inviting, cozy, with a slight lived-in feel that made you feel like you were always welcome. David's car was parked in the driveway, but the house was unusually still, too still. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I was walking into. I hadn't seen David since that brief meeting at the office, and honestly I wasn't sure what to say to him tonight. But as I walked up to the door and rang the bell, I tried to remind myself of one thing. Sometimes all you need to do is show up. Ellie answered the door quickly, a small smile on her face. She didn't look relieved, but she seemed grateful. Thanks for coming. Come on in. I followed her into the living room, where David was sitting on the couch, his legs pulled up, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked distant, like he was somewhere far away, even though his body was right there in front of me. David, Ellie said softly, almost as if she were afraid to disturb him. Jane's here to talk. Maybe you could try talking to her, huh? David didn't look up. His gaze was fixed somewhere off to the side, like he was staring through the walls, maybe even through time itself. But when he spoke, it was quiet, almost inaudible. I'm not here to talk. Ellie shot me a quick look, and I knew it was my cue to try something different, something more than just the typical conversation. I could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, like the air had been holding its breath for a long time. I walked over to the armchair near the window and sat down, giving him space but not letting the silence stretch on for too long. I get it, I said, my voice calm but steady. Sometimes it's hard to talk. Sometimes it feels easier to just keep things to yourself. But sometimes silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you feel more alone. There was a long pause before David shifted on the couch, looking over at me for the first time since I arrived. His eyes were tired, no, more than that. They were lost, I think. There was something in them that made me feel like I was looking at someone who had already seen too much for their age. Too much pain. Too much of the world that wasn't kind. Why do you care? He asked, his voice still low, but this time there was a tremor in it, a vulnerability that surprised me. I'm not your responsibility. I'm just a screw-up, a problem. His words hit me harder than I expected, and in that moment I felt a deep urge to tell him how wrong he was, how much potential he had, even if he couldn't see it. But I didn't. Instead, I just let the silence hang between us for a while, trying to understand what he was really saying. David, I finally said, keeping my voice soft but firm. I've been where you are. I've had days when I didn't want to face anyone, when everything felt like it was too much to bear. But one thing I learned is that no one is ever really alone, even if it feels that way. People care, whether you see it or not. He looked at me then, truly looked at me. There was something in his gaze that softened, just for a moment. He was still distant, but it wasn't the same coldness that had been there before. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to David, not just some wall of silence. I don't know how to fix it, he murmured, his words barely above a whisper. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes fixing isn't the point. Sometimes it's enough just to be present, to acknowledge that someone's pain is real, without rushing to make it go away. That's what he needed. Not answers, not solutions, just someone who would stand beside him, not to judge, but to let him know he wasn't invisible. I leaned forward, keeping my voice as gentle as I could. You don't have to fix anything right now, but you do have to let yourself feel something, even if it's just for today. Tomorrow doesn't have to be better. Just today, take a step, one step at a time. For a long time, David didn't say anything. His eyes dropped back down to his hands, and I could see the internal battle he was fighting. Ellie stood in the doorway, watching us quietly, like she was holding her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, David spoke again, his voice softer this time. I don't know if I can. I've been trying for so long, and nothing's worked. I know, I said, nodding slowly. But it's okay to not have all the answers. You don't have to have everything figured out. Just keep going, one step at a time. There was something about the way he looked at me then, a shift in his eyes, that made me believe, just for a moment, that he was listening, that he was starting to believe in the possibility of change, however small it might seem. And as I sat there, quietly with him, I realized something else. This wasn't just about helping David anymore. It was about learning to be vulnerable, to be open to people in a way I had never allowed myself to be. We didn't fix anything that night, but sometimes that's all you need, to sit with someone in their pain, to show up without any expectations, and to give them space to find their own way. And in that moment, I realized that I hadn't just helped David. I had learned something important, something that I wasn't expecting. And it stayed with me long after I left Ellie's house that night. I didn't expect the following weeks to unfold the way they did. After that evening with David, I thought we'd both go our separate ways, just two people with one fleeting moment of connection. But there's something about being truly seen, even for just a second, that lingers far longer than you'd think. I'd find myself thinking about him more often than I anticipated. I couldn't help it. The way his words still echoed in my mind, the look in his eyes when he let his guard down, even just a little. It was like I had unknowingly become part of his story, and I wondered how he was doing, whether he had taken those tiny steps he promised he would. It was about 2 weeks after that night at Ellie's house when I got a message from her, asking if I could meet with David again. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. I had hoped things had gotten better for him, that maybe he was finding his way, but I couldn't help but wonder, what was I walking into this time? "Jane, I think David's finally ready to talk," Ellie's message said. "Can you come by today? He's asked for you specifically." I didn't even have to think about it. I'd made a promise after all. And promises, as I had learned over the years, were important. I arrived at Ellie's house later that afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. The whole place felt like it had taken a deep breath, almost like it was holding its own little moment of peace. Ellie opened the door before I even rang the bell, her face a mixture of relief and hope. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside to let me through. "He's in the living room." I followed her inside, and this time it didn't feel as still as the last visit. There was a hum to the house, a quiet energy that told me something was different. Something had changed. I walked into the living room, and there he was, David sitting on the couch, looking almost normal, in a way. His posture was more relaxed, his face wasn't as tense. There was a calmness about him that I hadn't seen before, and it was both relieving and surprising. He looked up when I entered, and for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was there, just enough to make me believe that something had shifted in him. "Hi, Jane," he said, his voice still soft, but less guarded. "Hey, David," I replied, sitting down across from him. I didn't want to crowd him. I wanted to give him space to speak when he was ready, to not rush anything. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice slow, like he was testing the waters with his words. "About feeling stuck between two worlds. I didn't really get it at first, but now I think I do." I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he was piecing together thoughts that had been too difficult to articulate until now. I wanted to give him the time he needed, not interrupt, just let him speak. "I've been trying to be this version of myself that everyone expects me to be," David continued, his hands moving nervously in his lap. "You know, the kid who has it all figured out, the one with the plan. But I don't have a plan. I don't even know if I want a plan. Everything feels like I'm supposed to be something I'm not." I nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. "It's hard, isn't it? Feeling like you're supposed to fit into some mold that doesn't even fit you. But that's the thing, David. You don't have to follow anyone else's path. You just have to figure out your own." He looked up then, his eyes searching mine for some sort of reassurance. "But what if I don't know where to start? What if I don't even know who I am anymore?" The question hung in the air like a weight, and I felt it, how heavy it must have been for him to ask that. The truth was, I didn't have all the answers. I couldn't tell him what he should do next. But I could offer him one thing, something I wished someone had told me when I was his age, that it was okay not to know. You start by being kind to yourself, I said quietly. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to have all the answers. Just take it one step at a time. And it's okay if you don't know who you are right now. It's okay to not have everything figured out. David was quiet for a long time after that, and I didn't rush him. I just let the silence fill the room, letting him process, letting him sit with the words I had said. I could see his mind working, trying to make sense of everything. But the tension in his shoulders had loosened a little, and that, I realized, was enough. Finally, he spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said that night, about not being alone. Maybe I've been shutting people out because I thought I had to do everything on my own. But I don't want to do that anymore. I felt a wave of emotion catch in my chest. It wasn't a breakthrough, not exactly. But it was a start. The way he was finally letting down his guard, even just a little, was a sign. It meant he was beginning to trust. Trust in himself and in the people who cared about him. I think that's a big step, David, I said softly. It takes courage to admit that you don't have all the answers, but it also takes courage to let other people help you. He nodded slowly, the beginnings of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Maybe I don't need to have it all figured out today, but I'm starting to think maybe that's okay. Ellie, who had been standing in the doorway watching us, stepped forward then. Her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name. Relief, love, maybe a little bit of pride too. I'm so proud of you, David, she said, her voice thick with emotion. David's face softened at the sound of his mother's words, and for the first time, I saw something that I hadn't seen before, a connection between them that wasn't just the usual parent-child dynamic. There was something deeper now, something that had been missing before. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel it. David looked at me again, his eyes more open now, less guarded. I'm glad you came, Jane, he said, his voice steady. I think I'm ready to figure this out now. Not alone, but with help. And just like that, a new chapter began for David. Not because he had all the answers or because everything suddenly became clear, but because he had taken the first step. He had allowed himself to be seen, to be vulnerable. And that, I realized, was the hardest and most important step of all. As I left Ellie's house that evening, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. David had come a long way in a short amount of time, but the most remarkable thing wasn't his progress. It was how much I had learned from him. Sometimes we don't realize how much someone else's struggle can teach us. I'd gone into this wanting to help him, to offer him something. But instead, he had offered me something simple, but powerful. The courage to be real, the bravery to show up for someone, and the humility to admit that sometimes we all need help. The weeks that followed felt quieter, somehow, as though everything had shifted into a rhythm I hadn't quite expected. David wasn't fixed. No one is, really. But he was different. I noticed it every time I saw him, which, surprisingly, became more frequent than I thought. Ellie and I had been working on a few projects together at the office, and she started inviting David to drop by more often. At first, he'd only stay for a short while, his presence tentative, as though he was still testing the waters of connection. But over time, he became more comfortable, more at ease. His conversations were no longer just surface-level exchanges. There was a depth to his words, a willingness to engage that wasn't there before. It was a slow unraveling, but it was happening. And I think it was happening in ways that none of us, especially David, had expected. I remember one afternoon when Ellie and I were sitting in the break room at the office, going over some paperwork. David had been there with us for about an hour, his usual reserved self, but he didn't seem to be running away from the conversation anymore. He sat across from me, his body language less stiff, more relaxed. At one point, he caught my eye, and for the first time in a while, smiled, not the hesitant kind, but a real, genuine smile. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, as he swirled his coffee slowly in its cup, "about taking things one step at a time." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? What's been on your mind?" He shrugged, but there was a weight in his shoulders that seemed lighter than before. "I've been trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. I'm not sure yet, but I think I'm starting to accept that it's okay to not know right now." His words caught me off guard, not because they were groundbreaking or because I hadn't heard something similar from him before, but because of the way he said it. There was no self-judgment, no bitterness or frustration in his voice, just acceptance. "And that's huge, David," I said, leaning forward slightly. "The fact that you're okay with not having all the answers, that's something a lot of people, my age included, still struggle with." David looked at me, his eyes searching, almost like he was asking a silent question. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone more curious than defensive. I paused for a moment, thinking about my response. I hadn't expected this question. But it wasn't the first time I'd thought about it, not since our conversations had begun. I mean, even at my age, I sometimes feel like I should have everything figured out, that I should be doing more, being more, achieving more. But the truth is, no one really has it all figured out. The sooner we accept that, the better we can live. David seemed to think about that for a moment, letting the words sink in. It was the first time I saw him truly absorb something I said, like it was an idea he hadn't really considered before, but was willing to take seriously. For a brief moment, I felt as though we were both standing in the same place, looking at the same uncertain future, but together. "Maybe I can stop worrying so much about having a plan," David said, more to himself than to me, but I heard it clearly. "Maybe I can just be okay with not knowing." "You're already on the right track," I said with a nod. "You're exactly where you need to be right now." The conversation drifted into quieter waters after that, but there was a subtle shift that I could feel between us, an unspoken understanding that, while life may never fully make sense, we can still make peace with its unpredictability. It wasn't long after that day that David started to take more initiative, not just in his own life, but in his relationship with others. He came by the office more often, sitting in on meetings, chatting with some of the team members. Slowly but surely, he was becoming part of the world around him in a way that felt natural and unforced. Ellie had always been proud of him, of course, but now I could see something new in her eyes. It wasn't just concern or worry anymore. It was pride, real pride, like she was watching her son bloom into someone she hadn't quite expected. One afternoon, a few weeks after that conversation in the break room, I found myself standing by the office window, looking out at the street below. It was a beautiful autumn day, the kind where the sun paints everything gold, and the trees look like they're on fire with color. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. My mind just wandered, as it often did when I needed a break from my own busy thoughts. Then I heard a voice behind me. "You okay, Jane?" I turned to see David standing in the doorway, his arms crossed casually over his chest, a slight smirk on his face. He didn't look like the same young man who had walked into my office a few months ago, unsure and hesitant. There was confidence in his posture now, in the way he stood. "Yeah, just thinking," I said, turning to face him. "How about you?" "I'm doing okay," he said. "Actually, I'm doing better than okay. I think I'm figuring some things out." I smiled. Good. That's what I like to hear. He stepped further into the room, leaning against the desk. "I've been thinking about that talk we had, the one about taking things slow, not rushing. I don't know if I'm fully there yet, but I'm learning to let go of the pressure." "Pressure?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, the pressure to be perfect, to have it all figured out. I think I was just scared to let myself not have all the answers. But now, it's like I've realized I don't need them." Exactly, I said, feeling a sense of pride in him. No one has it figured out, and sometimes not knowing is the only way to really grow. David nodded, his eyes softening for a moment, like he was taking in the full weight of my words. Then, after a pause, he said, I want to thank you, Jane, for being there. I don't think I would have started making sense of things without you. My heart warmed at his words. I hadn't been trying to fix him. I hadn't been trying to save him. But somehow, that quiet presence I had offered him had made a difference. And that, I realized, was all that really mattered. I didn't need to fix the mess of his life. I just needed to show up, to let him know he wasn't alone. You don't have to thank me, I said softly. You did the work, David. I just helped you see it was okay to take that first step. He smiled then, that same genuine smile that had been so rare in the past. Well, still, I'm grateful. And I think I'm ready for whatever comes next. As I looked at him, standing there with his quiet confidence, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer the uncertain young man who had walked into my life months ago. This was someone who was beginning to understand his own strength, his own path, and it had been a privilege to witness that transformation. Before I left the office that evening, I stood by the window one last time, looking out at the sunset. The light was fading, but I felt a sense of peace, the kind that comes with knowing you've done something important. Life isn't about having all the answers. It's about being open to the unknown, to the people who walk into your life unexpectedly, and to the small but significant ways we help each other grow. And as I thought about everything that had happened, David's journey, Ellie's unwavering love for him, and the way our paths had crossed at just the right moment, I felt a quiet gratitude. Life had given me a gift, too, the chance to be part of someone's story, to witness the way they found their way back to themselves. And sometimes that's all the connection we need.